pages of Russian history. 1242. The German order of Teutonic Knights had invaded northeastern Russia and occupied the old city of Pskov. Under the leadership of their Grand Master, von Bock, they threatened to enslave the whole population of that area, including the capital, Novgorod. In their hour of peril, the Russian people turned for leadership to their prince, Alexander Nevsky. And on April the 5th, 1242, on Lake Peipus, the Russians met the might of the German forces. They weren't as well equipped or as well organized. But in their hearts was a flaming courage, a flame so fierce that it pierced the German army. The victory they won fills a bright page of Russian history. 1704, and another conquering army marched across Russian land. This time under Charles XII of Sweden, and again the Russians fought for their country. Led by their emperor, Peter the Great, after 5 long years of war, they defeated the Swedes in the historic Battle of Poltava. The invading Swedish armies were crushed and forever driven out of Russia. 1812. Napoleon and his armies had blazed their triumphant way across Europe and were marching on Moscow. The conquering armies entered the city, but they entered a city in flames. Even in that day, Russian earth was scorched earth to an invader. And once again, the invader was forced to start the long march on the road back out of Russia. 1914, and another German army, this time under Kaiser Wilhelm, set out to conquer Russia. This time, the Russian people, under the regime of the Tsar, were not only fighting German guns, but oppression and corruption in their own country. And only the ultimate collapse of Imperial Germany saved Russia from losing the Ukraine and the Crimea, which the Germans had occupied in 1918. Yes, for 700 years, the Russian people have had to fight to defend their land against would-be conquerors. Why? Why have all these attempts been made to conquer Russia? That's our own country 3 times over, or all of North America and 1 million square miles to boot. The sun never sets on Russia. When it is dusk on its western borders facing Europe, it is already dawn on its eastern borders facing the Pacific. That's Russia, or to be correct, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Deep in its mountains lie thick, rich veins of gold and silver. Below ground lie enormous deposits of forests cover millions upon millions of acres. 1/4 of all the lumber reserve in the world belongs to Russia. And as for fuel, there's coal, ton upon ton. And more important, there's also oil. 213 million barrels a year of it. Black gold flowing from the earth that contains 55% of the world's oil. What else? Iron? Russia has better than 10 billion tons. That can make a lot of steel before it's done. Yes, Russia is rich. Her farms cover millions upon millions of acres. The rich black earth that, besides giving forth oil and coal, will also grow everything from sunflowers to lotus. The tea her people drink in such huge quantities, and the tobacco that they smoke. Cotton grows here too, 3,800,000 bales a year. And sugar. And on the pasture land, the animals grow fat for food and wool for clothing. While on the warm plains, the fields of grain stretch as far as the eye can reach. Corn, oats, hops, rye, and don't forget wheat, 1/3 of the world's best. Yes, Russia is very rich, for it has not only raw materials and the products of its soil. Russia is also people. 193 million people. People of every race, color, and creed. People coming from the many different republics that comprise the Soviet Union. People speaking more than 100 different languages, but all citizens of one country. Whether they are the great Russians, the descendants of the first settlers of this vast area, and for 1,000 years its main population, or Cossacks, the famous horsemen from the open plains of the Don River Valley. Whether they come from the Southwest, the Ukraine, here in the breadbasket of the Soviet Union live the Little Russians, better known as Ukrainians, and beside them the Moldavians and Bessarabians. Or if they come from the far south, between the Caspian and Black Seas, where we find the Armenians and the Georgians, the Ingush, the Cherkess, rugged as the high peaks of their native Caucasian mountains. Whether they are Uzbeks, Turkmen, Kyrgyz, from the Persian and Indian frontiers, or Mongols, the Bashkirs, the Turco-Tartars, the Buryats, the Yakuts, from far beyond the Ural Mountains, or the people of the ice country, hunters like the Zambs, or settlers like the Laplanders. Whether they come from the pioneering wilderness of the far north, or from a great city like their capital, Moscow, where the ancient buildings of an ancient civilization stand beside the modern structures of a modern civilization, where the old Russian droshka still competes with the modern limousine. Whether they work in factories or as soldiers, whether they are bricklayers or traffic cops, sailors or riveters, school children, or farmers, nurses, or engineers, window washers, or sales girls, housewives, or postal clerks, radio announcers, or stewardesses, scientists, or typists, musicians, or ballerinas. Regardless of what they do or where they live, they all have one thing in common: love of their soil. That is Russia. Size, the largest country in the world. Raw materials, unlimited. Manpower, 193 million. These are the three reasons why every conqueror in history has wanted Russia. And these are the reasons why the modern would-be conqueror wrote,
"When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there."
Representatives urged binding agreements to support by collective action any nation submitted to attack.
The state I represent entered the League with the sole purpose of the maintenance of indivisible peace. The League of Nations is still strong enough by its collective actions to avert or arrest aggression. There is no room for bargaining or compromise.
It was Russia's weapon. Their industries, so recently built and which, like our own, were designed for the ways of peace, were converted for war. Instead of steel for plows and tools, steel for shells and guns. They knew their industry could never produce enough to adequately for the titanic struggle. But what they could produce, they would. At the same time, the army began to grow. More and more men were called up to be trained, hardened, drilled, prepared to defend their land. It was a defense in depth, line after line, far back into the interior. And when the Nazi wedge struck, the first line would bend with it until it became part of the second. Again, the wedge would strike. Again, a segment would be lost. But again, the line would bend until it became part of the third. So the deeper the Germans plowed into Russian soil, the stronger their opposition, until finally they faced an unshatterable wall and were robbed of their chance to hit that all-destroying blow they had counted on. The result? The Germans conquered land and lost the campaign. War inevitable instead of that quick decision the Germans sought. And the Russians had other tactics that threw the Germans for a loss. Germany had developed blitz warfare. Rostov, Kharkov, Kiev, Kursk, Smolensk, city after city standing in the path of the Nazi blitz. The Red Army had found a way to make their cities of great strategic importance. Odessa, scene of an heroic siege of more than 2 months, held up the whole Nazi thrust into the Crimea. Sevastopol, which resisted every attempt of the Germans to break through. Here, for 8.5 long months, the Russians fought for the town, inch by inch, barring the Germans from the great Black Sea naval base. Each house, room by room. The Russians knew their cities would be demolished, but their objective was not to save cities. Destroy Germans. A high price to pay for a copy of Mein Kampf. So the Germans were forced out of their armored shells to fight and to die in the hand-to-hand combat they thought they had abolished. There was another item the Germans had overlooked. They overlooked people. And generals may win campaigns, but people win wars. And on that fatal June 22nd, When the Russian people first learned of the invasion of their country, their grim faces told of their determination to fight and to die, but never to surrender. They knew this wasn't a question of who occupied what piece of land. This was a question of life or death.
This war is not an ordinary war. It is the war of the entire Russian people, not only to eliminate the danger hanging over our heads, but to aid all people groaning under the yoke of fascism.
So the alarm was spread to factory and farm. And from every Russian town and village, men poured forth to answer the call. From now on, one thing mattered and one thing only: victory. Total war meant total mobilization. Not war just for soldiers, but war for everyone. Young or old, male or female, made no difference. Age had nothing to do with it. If you were only 12 years old, there was work for 12-year-olds to do. Sex had nothing to do with it. If you could hold a rifle, you were a soldier. If you could turn a lathe, you were a soldier. If you could harvest the fields, you were a soldier. If you could handle a locomotive or pilot a ship or guide a tractor, you were still a soldier. For everything you did was part of that total war. Nothing that the enemy could use was left behind. Not a yard of wire or a pound of iron. Not an acre of wheat or a head of cattle. And the old men stood watch over the fields, ready to give the word to burn at the first sight of the enemy. Dam at Dnieperstroy, into which had been poured not only steel and concrete, but 5 long years of Russian toil and Russian sweat to yield the miracle of electricity to the farms and people of the Ukraine. Now, rather than let the power it generated fall to the enemy, they destroyed it. Behind the German lines, a new army was formed. An army without uniforms, whose home was the forest, and whose front was the enemy's rear. A guerrilla army. A minimum of glory and a maximum of determination. Their achievements were seldom recorded. Look well at these faces. You will never see them again in the ranks of war prisoners or read their names over heroes' graves. Ahead of them lay nothing but the rope and the halter, but they stayed behind and went on fighting. Their only goal was merciless destruction. Destruction of communication lines, supplies, the invaders themselves. Their weapons were dynamite and the terror of surprise. They asked for no mercy, and they gave none. This is the guerrilla army. This, the scorched earth. This, the Red Army. These, its leaders. These, but it wasn't the swastika that flew over the Russian capital. And it wasn't the Nazi conquerors who marched through the streets of the ancient city, but fresh reserves of the Red Army,